move on and return to this item of business at a later point. So the item of business that we're going to deal with now is a motion from the Committee for Education on post-primary transfer. I ask the Clerk to please read the motion.
That this Assembly takes note of the feedback to the Committee for Education's online survey into post-primary transfer testing and calls on the Minister of Education to outline contingency plans for post-primary arrangements.
Thank you. I call the Chairperson of the Committee for Education, Mr Lyttle, to move the motion.
Moved.
You certainly did get into that place in time. Thank you. The Business Committee has allowed 2 hours for this debate. The mover of the motion will have 10 minutes to propose and 10 minutes to wind. All other speakers will have 5 minutes. I call Mr Lyttle.
Thank you, Mr Principal Deputy Speaker. I begin in my capacity as Chairperson of the Education Committee and move this motion on behalf of the Education Committee, which calls on the Assembly to take note of the findings of the Education Committee online survey into post-primary transfer testing and the Education Minister to outline contingency plans for post-primary transfer tests this year. The motivation for this Education Committee survey, which was agreed by all main parties, and the focus of this motion today is the safety, well-being and equal educational opportunity of children in Northern Ireland during a public health pandemic. A pandemic that has taken life and livelihood across Northern Ireland and caused the Northern Ireland Executive to take extraordinary approaches to almost every aspect of society. The closure of schools and significant disruption to education across Northern Ireland from March to June 2020 led to the replacement of GCSE, AS and A-level examinations with centre-assessed grading and, crucially, prevented school-based preparation for post-primary transfer testing. At that time, the post-primary transfer tests in questions were scheduled to take place about now. The first AQE Common Entrance exam would be taking place this Saturday in the middle of a 4-week COVID-19 circuit breaker. In these extraordinary circumstances, the Education Committee engaged with providers of these private tests, the AQE, PPTC, wrote to every selective school in Northern Ireland and consistently questioned the Education Minister to ask what contingency plans were being put in place for post-primary transfer this year. The response, or lack thereof, that the Education Committee received was concerning, and we therefore sought to engage more widely with parents, guardians, teachers and children and young people via the online post-primary transfer survey. The survey was unanimously agreed by DUP, Sinn Féin, SDLP, UUP and Alliance Party members of the Education Committee, with the assistance of the Assembly engagement team. It was completed by over 8,500 people. Approximately 6,500 respondents were parents and guardians, about half of which are responsible for children in P6 or P7. Around 1,800 respondents were teachers, with about half teaching P6 or P7 pupils, although disappointingly the Education Minister refused the Education Committee request for the survey to be sent to all teachers in Northern Ireland via the C2K network. About 750 respondents were children or young people, of which 3/4 indicated that they were entering P7. I'll say more about the findings of the survey in my capacity as an MLA. However, some of the key feedback from the survey was that a majority of parents and teachers surveyed were very or extremely concerned about children sitting transfer tests further to a period of significant disruption. Despite the efforts of the Education Minister to facilitate private transfer testing of P7 children this year, including the drafting of a ministerial direction to the Education Authority and the fast-tracking of enhanced application and appeals processes, the Education Committee remains concerned at the lack of any concerted scoping of alternative arrangements for the post-primary transfer of children during a pandemic that is causing significant disruption to their education and preparation for these examinations, and unanimously calls on the Education Minister to outline substantive contingency plans for this academic year. Mr Speaker, I'd like to add a few comments in my capacity as an Alliance MLA. As I've already stated, the motivation for this survey and the focus of this Assembly and the Minister of Education must be the safety, well-being and equal educational opportunity of children. I would ask the Education Minister to stop misrepresenting my integrity and advocacy on this matter as an anti-grammar school campaign. It's not, and it is unedifying and not a serious response to a very serious matter. There are non-selective grammar schools in Northern Ireland. My understanding is that a grammar education is an approach to education, not a system of admissions for education. It is possible to hold that academic selection is unfair and unnecessary as a system of post-primary admission and to not be against academic or grammar approaches to education. Teachers can differentiate their teaching approach to different aptitudes within a school without an archaic admissions system to differentiate pupils by school. Mr Principal Deputy Speaker, this is, however, a wider debate regards academic selection that this Assembly needs to have in an open and inclusive manner, and it is my profound regret that the collapse of the Executive in 2017 stopped an inquiry into post-primary transfer initiated by the previous Education Committee. This motion is about how we transfer thousands of 11-year-old children this year in the midst of a global public health pandemic that has claimed tens of thousands of lives in these islands and disrupted almost every aspect of our way of life. We have closed schools for months and cancelled some of the most important exams possible. Yet, in this context, the Minister of Education remains adamant that it is safe, fair and appropriate for 10 and 11-year-old children to sit up to 5 examinations in January and February 2021. Principal Deputy Speaker, how in this context can it be safe or fair for the Education Minister to allow private transfer test providers to require 10 and 11-year-old children to sit up to 5 examinations in January and February for admission to post-primary school during a public health pandemic when he can legislate otherwise? When 8,500 responses to an Education Committee survey include over 60% of parents and guardians and teachers very or extremely concerned about children taking tests this year, a highest scoring preferred approach for post-primary transfer this year among parents, guardians and teachers of not sitting the tests and using non-academic admissions criteria instead, and 43% of parents, guardians and teachers of the opinion that post-primary transfer tests should be abolished. When tens of thousands of pupils have been in self-isolation since August, and it is time for the Education Minister to provide full, open and transparent information on the extent of this self-isolation, rather than obfuscating behind codes and percentage figures. The Education Minister says there is no alternative admissions criteria. His own Department of Education recommends alternative admissions criteria. DE Circular 2016/15 advises all grant-aided schools on post-primary admissions and recommends categories such as free school meals, named primary schools, named areas, nearest suitable school, sibling at school as appropriate criteria. What has the Education Minister himself done to scope alternatives? With whom has he engaged on this matter? Principal Deputy Speaker, children deserve better and more from the Education Minister, and this Assembly motion calls on the Minister of Education to outline an alternative contingency plan for post-primary transfer this year. I hope he has one, and I commend this motion to the House today. Thank you.
Thank you. As I said, every person called will have 5 minutes to speak. The next person on my list is Robin Newton.
Thank you, Mr. Principal Deputy Speaker. And first of all, can I thank Louise Close and her team and colleagues in the Assembly engagement team for what was, I think, a very useful exercise. And at this stage, I do want to pay tribute to principals, to boards of governors, to teaching staff, and all the support staff in the way that they have reacted over this pandemic situation. I think we owe all of them a debt of gratitude. And I have to say, I do welcome, despite the Chair's remarks, which I find somewhat nearly insulting, to be honest. But anyway, despite his remarks, it was right to do the survey. It was right to do a survey in the middle of a pandemic. And given the circumstances that we all found ourselves in, an unknown circumstances, place we had never been before, it was right to do that. And I'd have to say I do welcome that today all our schools are open and the teaching staff are there and the children are being educated. And the very fact that that is happening, I think, stands in stark contrast to the very negative approach that the Chair of the Committee has taken. I want to refer to the survey, and maybe just before I do, some remarks he made about the children being always safe, school principals, teaching staff always being safe. Nobody would in any way dispute that. It should go without even being saying that we would want the very best protection that we can have for the teaching staff and the pupils in every school, from the front gates of the school until the children come back out again, in whichever circumstances the children find themselves in. And that should go without saying. But just in referring to some of the findings of the survey, and I note that the Chair is going to refer to these when he's speaking as an MLA. Post-primary test, young people survey. And before we had the COVID-19 crisis, 91% of those who responded were planning to sit the transfer test. 91% were planning to sit the transfer test. And indeed then, when the COVID-19 situation occurred, responding on how they felt about children taking the post-primary transfer test, lockdown period, 61% of parents or guardians, 64% of teachers, and 67% of others stated that they were concerned, extremely concerned even. Well, it would have been strange if they weren't concerned in those circumstances. And those circumstances were having an impact across every sector of industry. And then when we asked the question about the post-primary, when a similar question of 45% of young people wanted the test to run as planned rather than changing the date of the term. 25% felt that schools should use a different way to access academic ability based on scores in primary schools, and 14% felt that they should be delayed until January 2021. So, when asked the question about when to run the test, 45% wanted to run the test as planned in the autumn, 25% felt the schools should use a different way, and 12% felt that the tests should not be run. Mr. Principal Deputy Speaker, when young people themselves were asked about whether or not tests should be abolished, 35% of young people felt that tests should be retained, 14% felt that they should be changed, and the 13% were unsure. So it's 35% retained against 38% abolished, and up to 62% who wanted them either retained, changed, or were unsure of the situation. I will give way.
Member for giving way. I note the member mentions young people. We are talking about children, and we are talking about a pandemic. Does the minister, or does the member believe that it is fair on those children to be put into this situation, given all of the great challenges that our society and our young people have faced this year?
Member has an additional minute.
I think the question is a fair question. as whether or not children should have been put into the situation. But the children were included within the survey. That's a fact. If we look at the results of post-primary transfer of parents and guardians, before the COVID-19 crisis, 75% of parents and guardians were planning for the child to take the transfer test. 21% were not, and 4.5% specifying others. The results of this, in terms of what I believe, Mr. Principal Deputy Speaker, that underneath, and I think it is right that the survey was done, but underneath it all, there is this current running against the selection and running against the grammar schools, as indeed we know them at this moment in time.
I'm afraid the member's time is up.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call Ms Karen Mullan.
Sinn Féin supports this motion brought forward today by the Education Committee. And as the Deputy Chair of the Committee, I am impressed by the number of people who took part in the survey. And like the member across, I would also like to thank Louise and the Assembly team for the work that they did. Over 8,500 respondents. This shows the intense level of interest on the issue of post-primary transfer, and in particular the worries over this year. Parents, children and teachers responded to the survey. That is why this piece of work was so valuable. It reflects the reality on the ground of what transfer is like here. First off, I want to say that Sinn Féin's position on these unregulated tests used by some schools, carried out by private companies, is clear. They should be abolished, but for the purpose of today's debate, I will mainly focus on this year's situation brought in by COVID. The use of this system discriminates against children from socially deprived backgrounds, those with a special educational need, and those who have social and emotional needs. Over the past week, I have been contacted by many parents, teachers and concerned groups. Unfortunately, I don't have time to read out all, but I want to thank them for getting in touch. But I do want to read out a piece sent to me by a Primary 7 teacher. She says, "The present for children, parents and teachers alike is unimaginable. I teach in a socially and economically deprived area, and there is only one pupil in my class being tutored. I overheard a girl in my class ask a boy why he wasn't doing the transfer test, and he said, 'Sure, you can only do the transfer test if you are loaded.' That tells a very heartbreaking story that a child at 10 years old would be so aware and would relate a test to money. This isn't academic selection," she says, "it's social selection." She goes on to say, "Children missed out on months of education. I have some children who are taking the test who didn't log in or engage with me during the entire lockdown period. In terms of teaching and learning, I am trying to deal with the day-to-day issues in relation to COVID whilst trying to cover a vast amount of work that was missed." Mr. Principal Deputy Speaker, there is now a culture of private tutoring for many children. I would like to ask if the Minister has agreed for funding given by this Executive for the Engage programme to be used by primary school pupils to purchase an online tutoring app, and what his department is doing to ensure that the Engage funding is used to support all children who have fallen behind because of the disruption in their education. As outlined by the Chair, when teachers were asked what their preferred method of transfer was, the most popular position was to not run the test this year and for schools to use non-academic admissions criteria. Teachers were also asked how they felt about children taking the transfer test following COVID, and 92% were concerned in some way. But what is striking about the survey, and also deeply unsettling, is some of the common words that arose from the feedback from young children in relation to the transfer test. Worried, nervous, scary, unfair, stress, concerned and sad. These are 10-year-old children in the midst of a global pandemic. Where is the compassion for them? Many teaching unions have shown leadership on this issue and have called for an end to academic selection. I want to commend that leadership, and I also want to commend the leadership of the schools so far who have decided not to use the transfer test this year and in particular St Colum's and Thornhill colleges in Derry. And finally, Mr Principal Deputy Speaker, the survey, similar to this House, does not find consensus on the issue of post-primary transfer, but it is clear that new arrangements must be considered if we are serious about putting children first in our education system. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr Daniel McCrossan.
Thank you, Mr Principal Deputy Speaker. As SDLP Education Spokesperson, I too welcome the opportunity to participate in this important debate, and I know and want to acknowledge at the outset that this is and has been for some time a controversial and divisive subject of debate. But it is imperative that pupils, parents and schools have clarity for the future, especially given the impact the current pandemic is having on education as a whole. I'd like to take this opportunity to put on record my appreciation to the many teachers and school staff who have gone back into classrooms and schools across Northern Ireland today. They are working under intolerable conditions and are in uncharted waters. In this regard, I wish all our staff and pupils a safe return to our schools. And I also note, just at that point, that I would hope that the Minister does everything within his power to provide the necessary support to our teachers in the school environment who have found the opening of schools after the first wave to be an entirely very stressful situation. I'm sure that has been well noted to him. Mr Principal Deputy Speaker, the SDLP believes at its core that academic selection is grossly unfair and in major need of an overhaul. Due to the inaction or unwillingness of this House to tackle the issue, we are now left with unregulated transfer tests which are not in the best interests of all of our children across Northern Ireland. It's almost a hokey-cokey approach in terms of how this has been dealt with. In addition to these concerns, we do believe that the concerns of parents and teachers regarding the current use of transfer tests needs to be addressed, especially in the context of this pandemic. In this regard, I welcome the survey conducted by the Education Committee, and I want to take this opportunity to thank committee staff involved and Assembly staff in bringing it forward. Mr Principal Deputy Speaker, the Education Committee set out to gauge the opinions of parents, teachers and other stakeholders during an online survey that ran between the 7th of July and Monday the 7th of September, where, as already mentioned by my committee colleagues, 8,528 responses were received. This work was bolstered by a young person survey which resulted in 754 completed surveys. The findings of the survey highlight that there is significant concern out there among teachers and parents concerning transfer tests proceeding in January 2021, and I wish to cover a number of these items in this contribution. The biggest concern surrounds the interruption to education in Primary 7, children having their education in Primary 6 significantly disrupted by the restrictions brought in to tackle the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, these children could not have properly completed the whole curriculum in English and Maths during this period. What's more, the blended learning children were encouraged to engage in during lockdown has now been recognised to be a much less effective way of learning when compared to face-to-face teaching. Obviously, postponing transfer results until January is a small consolation to these many pupils and does not afford them with enough time to deal with the huge deficit in learning opportunities lost out during the course of this pandemic. To compound this, since our schools reopened for the current academic year, we've seen massive disruption to the current Primary 7 cohort, with over half of our schools impacted by over 2,000 COVID-19 cases. This has had a significant impact on pupils personally in terms of their own health or that of their families, and also in terms of their mental health and having to deal with family illness or even death in some circumstances. Expecting pupils who have had to suffer such sit through a test that will, in most aspects, determine their very own futures is absolutely reprehensible on this occasion. It is the view of the SDLP, Mr Principal Deputy Speaker, now that schools have returned after half-term break, that the disruption to education the virus has posed will only worsen given the onset of winter weather conditions conducive to its spread. Things may get worse over the Christmas period that could result in disruption to schools in January. The impact of lockdown has also had the same impact across the student population. Reports show us, for example, that those from a disadvantaged background, as outlined by Ms Mullan, will be more disproportionately impacted as a result of this pandemic, and also in terms of what is expected from them as young people, as children, because we are talking about children. We mentioned young people, we're talking about children. Remember their ages, and they've went through a very, very difficult period this year in their learning. We need to support them. But if there is consideration given to removing this year, Minister, please ensure that there is a fair process in place to ensure that children from disadvantaged backgrounds have access to the opportunities as those from more affluent areas, which clearly seems to be the issue in this regard. Thank you, Mr. Principal Deputy Speaker.
Mr. Robbie Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Principal Deputy Speaker. I thank the Minister for being here to hear this really important debate today. I want to thank the Chair of the Education Committee and all of the members on the Education Committee for putting into this consultation. We spent some time, Minister, agreeing the questions that went into the consultation. The people that put it together, in particular Louise, want to put on record my thanks to those people. I want to thank the teachers and pupils and parents who also contributed to the returns within the consultation. And if there's one thing that it has shown us, is that the public and teachers and pupils are as divided on the subject of academic selection as we are. And what I'm glad so far in the debate is that we haven't hankered too much in and around the percentages and the returns, because it doesn't provide the answer. And I don't think today is the day to be addressing transfer testing in its holistic nature. That's a part of the transformation of education, and I think that would be the grown-up place to discuss that. The Minister has outlined from the very outset of his mandate that he would hold fast to... Yes, of course.
Referred to the selection test. Would the member agree with me that it was an irresponsible action to do away with the 11+ before an adequate discussion took place, negotiation took place, and another system identified to be put in place?
Thank the member
for has an additional minute.
Thank you. Thank the member for his intervention. It was before my time, but what I do know from my own background working in the fire service, that when you're in the midst of a crisis, you don't make draconian actions. You take measured steps and you do them in a thoughtful process. And I would say with education, that's what we need to do. If we want to get rid of academic selection, what we actually need is we need tried and tested alternative arrangements, which actually I don't believe are there, and will be borne out by what I'm going to share, actually, from the results of the consultation. I do agree with the sentiment of the motion. I do support it. The Minister does need to do something here with regard to providing contingency plans in the event that, if the test does go ahead, we need to know that our children are safe, and Daniel had picked up on this point. Our children need to be absolutely safe. Now, there's 8,700 responses to this. There's also 7,000 responses to the Bring It Back to Primary motion petition as well. So there are measures that we can take, Minister. We can reduce the amount of tests that pupils sit this year also, and there are things we can do. And if in the event that the COVID takes us to the place where we don't take the test, we need to ensure that those alternative arrangements are actually fair, and as can be found in the consultation, people don't agree that they are any more fair than the transfer fair test. It was split right across parents, it was split across teachers, it was split across pupils with regard to whether the test would go ahead or not. And I, like many of you guys, have taken multiple emails from teachers and people with vested interest as to what we should do. And I hope at the end of this the Minister does outline some of the contingencies that he is considering. I want to pick out just one or two, and I'm not going to labour too heavily on the statistics. But the Chair has pointed out that there's a strong voice for the abolishment of the test, but similarly, 48 to 50% either want to keep it or reform it. It's a balanced place, guys. It's not as straightforward as just abolishing it. I do go back to Mr. Newton's point that if we are going to get rid of it, we need to ensure that whatever comes to replace it is better and fairer, not just a change for change's sake. One of the things, and I'm going to pick up, it was the Deputy Chair and Daniel, I'm sorry to do this, guys, but one of the things that I was deeply saddened about in the consultation, and both of you have picked it up for the right reason, is those people who are socially disadvantaged, children on free school meals and SEN pupils. And the disappointing thing is that when the question was asked to respondents, what are the alternative arrangements that you would like to see, do you know what finished bottom of the pile? Those on free school meals and those with special education needs. And that wasn't politicians that were coming back with those answers. That was that was probably the most disappointing thing in the survey for me, that when we're trying to tackle educational underachievement, if we're trying to pull people up and not push anybody down, how can we do that when we already know academically those that suffer most of those in the socially disadvantaged areas, perhaps on free school meals, and those with special education needs? The consultation told us that actually those were the two areas of least importance for alternative arrangements, and that really was something that I was surprised at, Mr. Principal Deputy Speaker. I know Daniel will probably bounce on me on this one. One of the lights, if you like, one of the good points of the consultation was the response of our children. Now, you know that mental health is my soapbox, if you like. It's the thing that I want to drive and talk about. I'll talk to anybody about it. What I think we underplay at times is the resilience of our children. We underplay the resilience of our children and our young people. And it was the P7 cohort of this year who came back in quite strong numbers and said, do you know something? I think we need to do the test this year. And there was an interesting part of the consultation which picked out those children in those schools who have decided not to do the test. 82 of those children who are in those schools responded to the consultation and said they feel that they have now been disadvantaged because they're not getting an opportunity to do the test. And that's out of the mouths of the babes. We have to listen to our young people too, and we have to take on board their wishes, because they've been preparing for this, not just for this last 2 or 3 months, but this is a system that they have known and been aware of since they were in P1. It may not be the best. It may not be the best, but we can improve it and we can do a whole lot. We can do a whole lot better. The end of the survey, Mr. Principal Deputy Speaker asked for the young people to give 3 words, and the Deputy Chair picked out a couple. I'm going to give them a couple. Whether they do the test or whether they don't, each and every one of them, you are enough. Thank you.
Mr. Maurice Bradley.
Thank you, Mr. Principal Deputy Speaker. And like other members, I would like to thank Louise and the Assembly team for the hard work that they undertook in bringing this survey forward to the Education Committee. The survey itself was a good yardstick for debate going forward, and also, as already been alluded to, it provided food for thought. Whilst I have no objection to the motion, I would agree that there needs to be serious thought to transfer tests this year, and I would agree that I support the transfer test, but I also support reform to the transfer test. Good, serious reform, not a knee-jerk reaction to something, as happened with the 11 plus. Certainly.
Thank the member for taking the intervention. When we talk about reform of the transfer test, what about reform of the education system so that children don't think they're being disadvantaged if they can't go to their nearest school?
Member has an additional minute.
Thank you, Principal Deputy Speaker. And I thank the member for her intervention. And of course, she is right. It's incumbent upon this House to have a proper debate around the reform of education. And I would agree with her on that. But I do support some sort of transfer test. But I do feel that it has to be reformed in a great way. I also would like to make a point that it's parents and not the Education Minister who puts their children forward for the transfer test. So therefore, in that light, I think it's unfair to criticise the Minister on this. The survey itself, I would ask a question because I don't know the answer. How many respondents could use the same email address or IP address from the same household? Was it open to all within each household, or was it a single response per IP address or email address? Something I don't know. On safety, I would like to see a greater rollout of IT equipment and lack of broadband availability properly addressed. And I know the Minister will already be making plans for a fair and equal transfer test. In closing, Mr. Principal Deputy Speaker, I would be confident that the Minister will have a plan B to cover further disruption to the school year owing to COVID-19, should it be necessary. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. John O'Dowd.
Thank you, Príomh Lascan Cordia, and it's been an interesting debate thus far, and fair play to the Education Committee for commissioning the survey and the work they have been involved in around the transfer test, and particularly this year's transfer test and the difficulties that has brought. Like all aspects of our lives, COVID-19 has had a dramatic impact on education, and I welcome the fact that today our children and young people are back in their schools. I think it is important that the Executive does everything within its powers to ensure that our schools remain open, and that there's a responsibility on parents and others in society to make sure that happens. So we have to mind our actions and be socially responsible, whether it's around the school gates or any other aspects of our lives, because when I hear the figures of the COVID infections in schools, the first question I ask myself, was the infection caught in school or as a result of activities outside the school? And that's an important factor. But the safety of our pupils, our staff, is vital. So we all have a part to play in that. But in terms of the question in front of us today, very quickly, yes.
Member for Given Way. Does the member agree with me that the expectation that principals or school leaders should carry out the track and trace within the school themselves is unfair and adds to an already very difficult time for them?
I think it's grossly unfair, and it has placed huge pressure on our schools, on our principals and on our teachers. And without them, in many cases, tracking and tracing wouldn't exist, because they're doing it, so it wouldn't exist. So I think it's one of the elements the Executive has to look at as we move forward towards a proper tracking, tracing and support element. As I said, I'm an avid opponent of academic selection. Not that I'm opposed to grammar schools or I'm opposed to A, B or C. I'm opposed to academic selection because there is no evidence to support academic selection as giving added value to your education system. But there is a weight of evidence to show that it damages your education system and that it damages young people. I can think of no other area of public policy that has so much evidence weighted against it. In any other circumstances, our media would be lambasting us on a daily basis for continuing to use academic selection. But apart from a few, for whatever reason, and I have reasons of my own why they do it, our media supports academic selection on the basis it has parental support. Well, smoking in bars used to have support. Driving without seatbelts used to have very popular support. There are people out there who will tell you that COVID-19 doesn't exist. There were people out there, in fact I was stopped recently on a walk by a guy who tried to shake my hand, took offence because I wouldn't shake his hand, then tried to tell me there was no such thing as COVID-19. So there's opinions about everything, but there's evidence and then there's opinions. And the evidence tells us that academic selection is bad for your education system. So that's the responsibility we have as legislators, to ensure that something that is bad policy is removed. Now, in particulars of this year, why are we having this debate? We're having this debate because two private companies are supplying our schools, our publicly funded schools, with tests. Now, I don't know what committee in this House those two private companies are accountable to. They're not accountable to the Minister, in fairness, because academic selection is outside the remit of this Minister. So they're not accountable to him. They're not accountable to the Education Committee because they're two private companies. So the question is, why are two private companies interfering in our education system in the first place? But I think in terms of the timing of the test, etc., schools have a huge responsibility here too. There has been schools that have led by example, and there are schools that have stepped forward and says we won't be carrying out academic selection this year, and I hope that continues. But there's no reason why all schools shouldn't step forward and say we will not be carrying out academic selection this year. They don't have to wait on an instruction from the Minister. I would love to stand here and lambast the Minister, trust me. It'd be an easy speech. He has certain responsibilities around all these things. But we have devolved significant powers to our post-primary sector. Whether it's a grammar school or not a grammar school, they have significant powers. The Board of Governors carry significant powers in their hands. So they have a responsibility to step forward and say there will be no academic selection this year. And that in itself will lift huge pressure off our children and young people. Those who suggest that the test should be returned to the primary schools, I object to it. And I object to it on this basis. What about those children who are not sitting the test? My colleague Karen has given a very good example of a P7 teachers. Why should them children's education be disrupted and be abused because some either want to or are being told to, that they have to sit a test. Totally unfair and totally unwrong. And in fact, this entire debate, not singularly this debate in this chamber, but the debate about the test, has been about a section of our education system and a section of our pupils. And that's what's wrong with academic selection. Because when you have academic selection, the focus of the whole machine turns towards those who are doing the test, and they leave people behind. So if you want evidence of what's wrong with academic selection, listen to the debate of this last few weeks and few months, because it's about the few
Members'
and
time
not
is
the
up.
many. And our education system has to be about all our children. Thank you.
Thank you. Given that it is just past 5 to 2 and question time is due to commence at 2 o'clock, the next speaker on my list was Mr McNulty, but I don't think it would be fair to curtail him in that way. So if I could ask, or perhaps it would be, I don't know. If I could ask members just to take their leave while the ministers come into the chamber for question time.
Members, we now return to the Committee for Education's motion on post-primary transfer testing. I can see Sir Justin McNulty on council. I call Justin McNulty.
And on this All Souls Day, I think we should all take a moment to remember the souls of people close to us, our loved ones, and also the souls of those who have passed as a consequence of this pandemic and during this pandemic. Today, I know there are so many parents and young people who are breathing a huge sigh of relief because schools have reopened. I also know there are many parents and teachers and principals and school staff who are still worried and who have concerns and who have unanswered questions. So they deserve huge credit in stepping up to put the education of children and young people first. I welcome the opportunity to take part in this debate, and like others, I commend the work of the team who oversaw this insightful survey, and I recognise the invaluable contributions of the over 8,000 respondents. I must also reiterate my party's position in our opposition to academic selection for kids at age 11. That view has been held by our party since our formation, and it still holds true today. However, this debate is not about the actual policy of academic selection. This debate is about addressing an issue facing young people in the midst of a global pandemic. Children have already experienced enough disruption to their education this year. There are obviously impacts to their academic education, but there are also unintended and unquantified impacts to their emotional health, their physical health, their mental health, and their general well-being. There can be no doubt that this pandemic has most adversely impacted children and young people from disadvantaged backgrounds and those with special educational needs. We should not do anything that adds to the pressure on them and inhibits their opportunities educationally or increases their mental or emotional strain. We have a duty to do everything in our power to protect our citizens, and especially our young people, and most especially our young people from disadvantaged backgrounds or those with special educational needs or complex needs. I, like others, commend the schools who have recognised the very difficult situation facing 10 and 11-year-olds children. Those grammar schools, some in my own constituency, my old school, the Abbey, Our Ladies, the Sacred Hearts and St Comans, have postponed the use of academic selection for this year. The head teachers in those schools, as well as the head teacher in St Louis, Kilkeel, came together and made the brave decision to postpone the transfer test this year. Their collective decision, supported by their boards of governors, was focused on what was best and what was fairest for children and families in the midst of a global pandemic. In the midst of this crisis, the head teachers and the boards of governors of those schools all stood up and showed strong leadership. I applaud them all. In the event that the Minister continues to hold firm, and given the so uncertain trajectory of the coronavirus pandemic, would it be reasonable to ask school leadership teams to think of course?
Member for giving way, and the member rightly makes reference to those sections of our community school children who are most hit by this situation. And I know that he feels much the same as me for the shocking figure of the 2,000 children who are at risk in their own home, were at risk in their own home during school closure. Would you agree with me that there much more needs to be done between the Education Department and the Health Department on addressing the issues pertinent to those 2,000 children?
I wholeheartedly agree with the member. In the event that the Minister continues to hold firm, and given the so uncertain trajectory of the coronavirus pandemic, will it be reasonable to ask school leadership teams to think of our children and to follow the example of those other grammar schools and suspend testing this year? The debate on academic selection has been going on for years, and we can fight that battle on another day, but today I appeal for leadership. As I've said, Count Corla, today we have children and young people returning to schools. They've been asked to wear masks on school buses. They've been asked to sanitise their hands. They've been asked to keep their distance. They know we are in the middle of a pandemic. They know we are in extraordinary times. And I agree with other speakers. Most children are resilient, and they have the ability to adapt to whatever arrives. And that is a brilliant trait of youth. But some children and young people do not have that capacity through no fault of their own. It is those children who we should be thinking about when making decisions about the fairest and best way to proceed. We must act now and postpone these tests. We need a unified and consistent approach. We owe it to our most vulnerable and disadvantaged children and young people.
I call Rosemary Barton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I welcome the opportunity this afternoon to participate in this debate. As a former teacher in a non-selective school, I watched year upon year as Year 8 pupils arrived in their pristine new uniforms on their first day at the big school. There were those who had not sat the post-primary transfer, who considered examinations a real inconvenience in their lives. Then at the opposite end of the scale, there were those who sat the post-primary transfer and were so disappointed in not succeeding, while finally there were those who were encouraged by perhaps parents and teachers to have a try, but were really not concerned about the final outcome. Yes, it was obvious that some of that Year 8 group were suffering from disappointment following their encounter with the transfer procedure. However, after half-term, many would say this disappointment had disappeared. They enjoyed life at their new school, and they began to view the experience in a positive light by turning this into a building block towards increasing their resilience opportunities. The keenness that many of these young people have for sitting examination is borne out by and reinforced by the Young People's Questionnaire, which has indicated that a similar percentage of pupils, 91%, wanted to sit the transfer procedure prior to COVID, while only 3% less wanted to continue to sit the transfer after the COVID. These stats prove that it is really, really important in the event of unforeseen circumstances in January that you, Minister, take all reasonable steps towards ensuring that the transfer procedure is not cancelled and there is emergency contingency planning in place for those young people to sit their post-primary transfer test. This contingency planning must give consideration to the location of the examination in combination with ensuring that the pupils have a COVID-reduced, safe experience while sitting the exam. Consideration regarding the safety and welfare of children must be the #1 priority. The experience in the past of hundreds of children gathering in a school gym, dining hall or a corridor of classrooms next to each other to sit an examination is neither a good example to set nor a very satisfactory arrangement towards the protection of these pupils. Will the pupils be distanced 2 metres apart? Who sanitises the desks, chairs, etc. before and after the exam? Will the pupils attending remain within their primary school bubbles or mixing with others from areas that are 50 miles apart? I therefore call on you, Minister, to work with the 2 private transfer examination providers to permit pupils to take the transfer examination in their own school, where they will be familiar with the tried and tested COVID-proof regulations. With regard to supervision of the examinations, both examinations financially charge pupils or an education body for the young people sitting this exam. So perhaps this finance could go towards the extra supervision necessary for these smaller sittings of the examinations in their own primary surroundings to ensure there will be safety. The UUP will be supporting this motion. Thank you.
I call Paula Bradshaw.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and thank you to my colleague Chris Lyttle, Chair of the Education Committee, for bringing this important motion forward today, and thank you, Minister, for being in the chamber to hear this debate. I wish to say just a few words on the more general situation which pertains to post-primary transfer testing in my constituency, because this is not solely an education issue. It ties in with planning, transport, social support and many other matters. Firstly, let us again be clear that transfer is a statutory function of the department. It is not adequate for the department to say, well, schools decide. The department has functions which include, but are not limited to, ensuring that, for example, Section 75 is adhered to. We are already seeing disadvantage in education being exacerbated by time having to be taken off school. And it is unacceptable for this simply to be ignored and hand over solely to schools to make the best they can of the situation. Secondly, let us be clear about the situation. Already we have clear warnings, notably from Wales, but implicitly from our own health advisors, that January will likely see coronavirus cases rising again. It is inconceivable that any sort of sensible testing could take place in such an environment. And just to pick up on the point that the previous speaker made there, parents are extremely concerned that if the tests are carried out in secondary schools, not their own children's primary schools, that they will come in contact with other children and adults, and the community transmission could be huge. So this is all entirely predictable. So we need to know now what the response from the Minister will be to this predictable situation. Thirdly, it is already the case that some schools are affected worse than others. Some have had to isolate for long periods, others not at all. There is absolutely no way that a crude test taken with many pupils inevitably absent, giving a clear advantage to those who have been least affected by the need to isolate, is in any way a sensible means of deciding which schools pupils go to. Mr Deputy Speaker, we have buried our head in the sand for too long. The fact is that it is already the case that parents try to make decisions on educational routes right from nursery age. In parts of South Belfast, primary schools are well oversubscribed, particularly maintained and integrated. In fact, 6 primary schools serving just one DEA in my constituency are at or over capacity, with demand continuing to exceed approved enrolments. And one reason for this is that it is perceived to be the best route to the post-primary schools that parents want to send their children to. Therefore, we already have reports of parents finding entry criteria confusing and of bottlenecks even at primary level as parents seek the most appropriate pathway. Yes?
Heard several times around Tyrone Arm, parents choosing to opt for transfer. However, in many instances, it's not really a choice, in that if your classmates, your friends, your cousins, everybody from around your neighbourhood are going to a particular school, it's really the only choice, and therefore it shouldn't really be considered a choice at all.
Members, an extra minute.
Thank you. Thank you, and I think my colleague Chris Lyttle touched on that at the start, some of the issues, but certainly agree with that. So yes, we've got the reports about the confusing entry requirements and the bottlenecks. But this is not exclusively about potential educational achievement. Issues such as proximity, as you've just mentioned there, after schools capacity and needed ethos play into such decisions. Needless to say, Mr Deputy Speaker, we find the integrated sector oversubscribed, and in fact there is evidence that it would be even more oversubscribed were it not still on what is now a rather old-fashioned requirement to carry out a head count. Mr Deputy Speaker, in conclusion, we must grab this opportunity to do away with an outdated selection system, which is barely fit for the second half of the 20th century, and develop an education system which meets the demands of the second half of the 21st century, focused on exporting products and services rather than people. Thank you.
Sir Matthew O'Toole on Cancha. I call Matthew O'Toole.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker, and thank you to the Committee for Education for bringing this motion to the House, which I, along with my party colleagues, are obviously supporting. Mr Deputy Speaker, before I want to make some general points about selection, as others have done, but I think it's important to first of all state, given what the motion is about and given that we're talking narrowly about 1 year today, I think it's important to say, first of all, that this year is like no other that any of us have lived through, and certainly unlike any that the very young children we are talking about today have lived through. As has been said repeatedly in this debate, particularly by my colleague Daniel McCrossan, we aren't talking about young people as in young adults. We're talking about children here. We're talking about children who have faced enormous amounts of disruption this year, not just this academic year, but since March, and will, it's entirely possible, face further disruption in the months ahead, because we are, as we know, a long way from having anything like a normal setup, albeit I'm glad that schools returned today. Mr Deputy Speaker, uncertainty and disruption in preparing for these exams has been and continues to be unacceptably stressful for children. I'm sure it's the same for all constituencies represented here today, that in recent months my office has been frankly inundated with parents deeply worried about their children, about their well-being, yes, in relation to COVID-related closures and the kind of learning opportunities they have had through the pandemic, but also in relation to the transfer test. And the two issues are, I'm afraid, completely and inextricably linked. It is the case that, as the Minister has said before, the disruption to learning for our children has been extraordinary this year. That makes the not proceeding with the transfer testing as normal all the more urgent. It makes it, frankly, all the more indefensible that we would simply leave this process unchanged. Mr Deputy Speaker, several of the parents who contacted me continued working throughout the pandemic. Many of them were essential workers, and many felt they had been abandoned and left to their own devices during the school shutdown period. Disruptions have increased because of self-isolation, and that will continue even with schools back today. We know that there will be continued issues around self-isolation and continued disruption to children who are at primary school and who will be asked to go through this transfer process in the months to come. The pandemic has added a layer of anxiety that is unique for this cohort of 10 and 11-year-olds. Only 5% in the committee's survey said their child was prepared, with the majority stating that their child was unprepared or disadvantaged. Going ahead, as I've said, Mr Deputy Speaker, with testing as normal this year, will only exacerbate existing educational inequalities, and those have been well rehearsed by several people in the Chamber, including Chris Lyttle, John O'Dowd, Karen Mullan, my colleague Daniel McCrossan and Justin McNulty. It is the case that this pandemic has exacerbated the existing educational inequalities in our system. Simply proceeding with transfer testing as if those inequalities hadn't been exacerbated is, I'm afraid, deeply irresponsible in relation to these children. I'd go on and I'd make a broader point about the transfer testing system, which is that... Yeah, I'm happy to give way. Yeah.
Is it not utterly fatuous to pretend that this attack on academics on the transfer test is really rooted in COVID? COVID is obviously a fig leaf for those who always have and always will be opposed to affording the ladder of elevation which transfer affords to many children. And should members not dispense with the shamelessness of pretending that this attack on the transfer has really anything to do with COVID?
Members, an extra minute.
Thank you very much. I'm glad actually to have taken that intervention, because it enables me to say very clearly, first of all, this debate is about COVID. It is completely unacceptable that we proceed with transfer testing this year of all years. But let me address the point the member has raised about this system. He says that it offers the ladder of opportunity. There is literally no evidence that the transfer testing leads to better outcomes for poorer kids. And that is based in no fact whatsoever. The fact that it continues to be asserted by people in this chamber without evidence is deeply, deeply problematic. And I'd give way to any member of this chamber who wants to stand up and offer me some rigorous, data-based, academically proven evidence that this offers good outcomes. The Minister, please stand up. Go ahead, give it to me.
The member raises that point. I appreciate his time is limited. Would the member not accept, first of all, we have in our 2 universities in Northern Ireland a greater level of social mobility than pretty much anywhere else in the United Kingdom for working class children to be able to get in? Secondly, that in terms of our academic results, they have consistently led all of the United Kingdom in both selective and non-selective education. Indeed, comparing, for instance, our non-selective schools in Northern Ireland with the schools in Wales, which are largely on a comprehensive basis, those outscore those there. Which it is clearly a level of attainment that is achieved via our system. Now, that stands in contrast to a situation where, particularly in England, where we find a situation where actually selection happens, but it's the 7% who can afford to pay for public schools. That is the real selection by money.
Time's up. Time's up.
I'm afraid I'll close up by saying we should not be proceeding. Minister, what you've given me is not data. It doesn't prove your point. We shouldn't be proceeding with these tests this year.
Time's up. We now move. No, she's not here. I now call Claire Bailey.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Well, 12 years. That's how long this Assembly has had since the last regulated 11+ test was carried out. The failure to take action on this issue in normal times is nothing short of a disgrace. For 12 years, we have had extensive feedback of wider civic opinion and expert recommendations for change, and here we have it again. The issue is the failure of successive executives to sort this out. And the Green Party are long-standing supporters, and proudly so, of the abolition of the academic selection process, because to allow children of 10 and 11-year-old to be subjected to that level of stress and worry should not sit well with any of us in a system that overwhelmingly favours those with the means to be coached and tutored. We allow children to be instilled with a feeling of failure and low self-worth at 10 and 11 years old, all the while knowing that some never regain their confidence. And I can clearly remember sitting my transfer test back in 1980. As far back as that, my results did not matter. Not because I wasn't impacted or because of my results, but because I went to an all-ability school. A school that streamed pupils according to their ability. And while some still might try and say that this is not a possible or a viable system to instil, I'd like to add that that school is now one of the most oversubscribed schools in Northern Ireland. It was also our first planned integrated school, and many said that that would never work either. And again, to this day, say that it's not possible to extend that transformation throughout our system. So let's stop pretending that alternatives are not possible, because they are very possible and they are working. The Committee for Education's online survey into post-primary transfer testing was clear. Parents and teachers alike are deeply concerned about the prospect of children undertaking these unregulated tests this year. This current cohort of 10 and 11-year-old children have endured so much upheaval in the past 8 months, with the disrupted school year and every other pressure that COVID-19 has brought. And we already know that the test creates a two-tier system that wrongfully disadvantages too many children from low-income families. To allow these unregulated tests to go ahead again for another year risks making the divide even wider. And who, in all seriousness, wants to willingly stand over that? Not every child has the same access to computers, to home-based support. Even with the return of schools, children have had varying degrees of face-to-face teaching due to the coronavirus outbreaks and lockdowns amongst teachers and pupils. The Green Party find it unconscionable that we require a child to sit these unregulated tests, unprepared and ill-equipped under any circumstances, and now during a pandemic and lockdown. Because every year, without fail, I have parents coming to me distraught that their child has not been accepted to any school, not just their preferred school. We have a ludicrous system where some schools accept one test, some accept another test, some accept both. Some look at what primary school you went to, some look at your siblings or your parents. Some look at where you live. Schools are left to their own devices, and parents are left to navigate a complex system of post-primary admissions that makes little sense, and our Education Minister holds his hands up and claims that it's nothing to do with him. Well, it does. Minister, you have the privileged position to stand up and sort this out, to do right by every 10 and 11-year-old child across Northern Ireland today. We are failing children. We are not upholding the right of so many to an effective education while we cling to an inequitable system on its last legs, refusing to step in, to step up and create an integrated education system fit for the 21st century. Our system is a mess. Let's take action now, build a framework to look beyond this year and make the opportunity to build back better. Thank you.
I call Kelly Armstrong.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. I'd like to start off by clarifying I'm not on the Education Committee, thank goodness, says some people, but I will declare an interest as I'm on the Board of Governors of 2 schools, one primary and one post-primary. I also don't have a child facing the transfer test this year. Mr Speaker, I've never had a child face the transfer test. My family chose not to go through the system as we didn't need to. The school my daughter attends is her closest integrated school to my home. They accept children on an all-ability basis. She's currently sitting her A-levels, so not taking the transfer test didn't hold her education back in any way, shape or form. As a parent, I would like to thank the Committee for Education for asking parents, teachers and children what should happen with the transfer test this year. I'm a huge supporter of co-production and co-design, and it's right that parents and children should be part of the debate. We all agree their voices are of paramount importance in this debate. As others have said, this is not a debate about whether we should have a post-primary transfer test or not. It's a debate about what should happen this year, in the midst of a pandemic. And before Mr Allister asked for an intervention, I don't support transfer tests, but this isn't about what I think. This is about what we should be doing for children to make a change to this difficult circumstances that they face. It is an important discussion about how child-centred our education system is. Children in this report have used words like stress, worry, nervous, excited, hard, scared, unfair. These are words coming from 10 and 11-year-olds. We have to do all we can to put children at the centre of considerations. I believe as adults, taking appropriate consideration, I will.
Member makes an important point about the word cloud that was used, and she has quoted the words. The other words that also appear are happy, important, excited, ready, good and useful.
Much to the member, but if he knows how word clouds work, the larger the word appears, then the more it has been said by children. So the words that he has used are tiny, whereas I think... Well, now we should be doing all we could do as adults to put children at the centre of this. We need to think about how the pandemic has already impacted those children. We need to be doing everything in our power to reduce the mental health impact on those children. And the post-primary transfer is one area that is creating stress on children, as they've said in their own words, at a time when society is under such stress from a killer virus. But there are some shocking findings in this report. Like, for instance, it came as, I'm disgusted by this comment, that the majority of parents, teachers and other interested parties in this survey felt that using free school meals as a potential criteria to use was a poor or very poor criteria. What is going on in our schools or with parents? To me, that suggests that adults don't want children who receive free school meals in a class with their child. That's horrendous. As someone who grew up with free school meals, I find that answer shocking. And it's something that I look back at education and say, what type of system are you making? There are other answers that don't come as a shock. 43% want the 11 plus or the post-primary transfer abolished, and 29 say reform. Minister, you've already reformed the GCSEs, ASs and A2s. Why not step in and change the post-primary transfer? And this is where we get to the nub of the matter. The post-primary transfer tests are not within the Minister's gift control because the Minister allows 2 private companies to use school premises to make money out of tests that stresses children and who have gone out of their way to protect their tests during a pandemic. When I say, Minister, you allow the post-primary schools to use, or these companies to do this test, you allow post-primary schools to issue criteria in the book. You allow grant-aided schools to have this test performed within their buildings.
The right of academic selection is there in law. It is not some whim. I mean, look, I'm supportive of academic selection, but it's not on some whim of me or indeed any other minister. It's there in the law. So I think members should be careful not to misrepresent the situation.
I'm not misrepresenting. You do allow the post-primary school test run by 2 private companies to be held in schools that you fund. This year we are in a pandemic and 10 and 11-year-olds already have huge mental health concerns. So on their behalf and on parents' behalf, I'm going to ask you very clearly, what specific advice has the Department of Education received from the PHA and the Health and Safety Executive regards test day arrangements for upcoming PPP-TTs that will be hosted in many grant-aid schools across Northern Ireland on a Saturday? Who's paying for that? The Department of Education has decided to use a variety of existing codes, namely 8, I, P and exclamation mark, to record non-attendance attributed to a variety of COVID-19 related circumstances. What was the rationale for using existing codes that retain their original purpose rather than creating specific and additional codes that has been done across England and Scotland, when they're much more clear-cut and honest? Where the aforementioned codes are used, non-attendance is only meant to be recorded if pupils are partaking in home-based learning. Can we have an update on the progress to blended learning? What additional methods are used by ETI to ensure consistency of standards and access to remote learning for children not physically attending schools because of COVID-19 related circumstances?
I ask the member to draw remarks to a close, please.
And finally, how much money is being paid into the system by these private companies who are getting our schools and our teachers to prepare children for their tests?
Sir Jerry Carroll, Hunt County. I call Jerry Carroll.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I think it's very important at any time, but especially in the middle of a global pandemic, that we listen to the voices of teachers, parents and young people. And this report obviously does that, and I think it's important that we're talking about it today. And I think the Minister should listen hard to what people have said in it. A concern of mine, and one shared by many others, is that the Minister hasn't listened to these voices all along and operated on the basis that he knows best, and whilst some of his party colleagues simultaneously engaged in a round of teacher bashing disgracefully during this pandemic. And it's worth saying, Mr Deputy Speaker, that unions in the north, in the south, in England as well, have already raised concerns about the reopening of schools as well. It needs to be put on the record too. I think it's important that the concerns of all those who took part in the survey are heard, and those in the community more generally. And of all the groups surveyed in relation to post-primary transfer tests following COVID-19, the lockdown period, 61% of parents and guardians, 64% of teachers and 67% of other interested parties stated that they were very or extremely concerned, and that was an attempt to dismiss that earlier on in the debate, but I think that's very, very important indeed. And when asked what their preferred approach for post-primary transfer would be for this coming academic year, the highest scoring answer for parents, guardians and teachers was to not run the tests and instead to permit post-primary schools to use non-academic admissions criteria. That's what they've said, and the Minister needs to take that firmly on board. And despite being told that we are in unprecedented times and everything needs to be on the agenda, it seems that the Minister is firm in maintaining a system that is unfair, as other people have said, labels people as failures from such a young age and puts them under enormous pressure. This isn't, Mr Deputy Speaker, the views solely of this socialist MLA, but it's the views of teachers in the survey, the largest proportion of whom call for the abolition of this test. Teachers and young people surveyed as well believe that it should be abolished also. Mr Speaker, the survey also shows a massive concern amongst parents, pupils and teachers about post-primary testing in general, with many calling for this system to be abolished. The concerns refer to the pressure placed on children, and also that academic selection is unfair and elitist, sentiments that I would certainly agree with. Yeah, I'll happily give way, yeah.
Thank you to the member for giving way. It does raise good points about the consultation. The consultation was excellent. Would the member agree with me that it was incredibly disappointing to see the level of responses with regard to free school meals and special education needs children with regard to the attitude to education at the next level?
Members, next for a minute.
I thank the member for his point. I do, and I'll come on to that in a second, around free school meals especially. So I would like to ask what's the Minister's rationale for keeping this antiquated system in place? How can he justify testing young people at this age and putting them through a tremendous amount of stress and pressure in the middle of a global health pandemic that has thrown all certainties up in the air and has been a particularly tough period for our young people? Safety and well-being of children, as the Chair said, was the reason behind this commissioning of the report. And I'm very concerned that the Minister appears to be more concerned about batting down the hatches and defending what always was, because it always was, and wants to maintain a transfer test at all costs and ignore the concerns of parents, staff and pupils in the survey. In addition, the Minister needs to look at how education works in places like Finland and other places to learn what's the best practice and the best approach. Finland regularly tops the table for being the happiest place in the world and is widely regarded as having one of the best education systems in the world, not to mention having extended maternity leave for parents as well. We would do well, the Minister would do well, to take our leave from what is being done in Finland, and especially here, and refer to Mr Butler's points, what is a overstretched and under-resourced education system that sees many pupils, including those with special educational needs, not get the support and assistance they need. Finland has equal access to education for every single pupil, and this is something that we should ensure is rightfully and accurately in place here. Another major concern highlighted in the survey was about the lack of support for free school meals. This House should send a collective thank you to Marcus Rashford, who has done more to highlight food poverty than any ever single government minister in the UK. This executive must now, and the Minister especially, must now begin plans to ensure that no child goes hungry, whether in school or at holiday periods, regardless of whether we are in a health pandemic or not. In one of the wealthiest countries in human history, it is morally repugnant. It's sickening, in fact, that children and families are forced to go without meals, and families are forced to choose between heating their home and eating for far too often. So I want to hear the Minister's plans in regards to those points raised by me, and also those very issues that are highlighted quite firmly in the survey. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Call Claire Sugden.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I want to give thanks to the Committee for Education, in particular the Chair, for commissioning the survey. Over 8,500 responses from various important stakeholders, including teachers, parents and school children. And 2/3 of those have responded that they are concerned about the transfer process this year. So if that in itself does nothing but to convince the Minister to reassure parents about what happens next, because this survey indicates that they aren't reassured, and I think he needs to do more in that respect, if nothing else. I didn't prepare for an academic selection debate. I'm cognisant enough to know that with time left in this mandate, we aren't going to be changing the way the process currently works. There's no political will. The Minister himself says that he supports academic selection. I will be generous to Mr Alister's comments in saying that the COVID situation does tend to highlight the cracks that already exist within the system, and that's not just with this issue, but right across government policy. And I think in terms of this particular issue, it does highlight the fact that the transfer process in Northern Ireland for over 10 years has been a mess, and we need to look at it, and we need to be sensible, and we need to be mature about what we need to do, what's best for our children. In an ideal world, in an ideal education system, every school would be the best school in Northern Ireland. Every school would be providing the best facilities, providing the best education. And that's why parents do choose academic selection, because they see that some schools are better than others. And that in itself is an issue, and it's something that we need to look at around this debate of transfer, because transfer is a symptom of the problems that exist within education. I do think this is an extraordinary year, and indeed to address those comments about this potentially setting a precedent for future academic selection debate, it doesn't have to. Any decision that the Minister can take can do so on the caveat that this was an extraordinary year, and it doesn't have to set an example. As I said, there's not enough time left in this mandate, and certainly there's no political will there, but there are a significant number of parents, teachers and children who are saying that what is happening now is causing them great anxiety. I wasn't in the chamber for other members' contributions earlier, but what I was really shocked to hear from a school teacher recently is that the lockdown period that happened from Easter onwards has actually had an impact on some children's educational development. Now, I can't say that that applies to all children across Northern Ireland, but teachers, the people who know best, I don't know anything about this. I'm not a parent, I'm not a teacher. I'm listening to my constituents, and they are telling me that they are seeing an impact on what that first period of lockdown has done to those children. So where are we now? We're now in the midst of a second wave, potentially anticipating a third wave in January. So there will be impact. And that impact is not only on their educational development, it is on their mental health, it's on their ability to socialise with other children, which seems to be one of the biggest impacts in stopping kids going to school. I also want to talk about the timing on this. We are now into November. The test is anticipated to take place in January. The decision to postpone it initially was an odd one. I appreciate it was in response to a court hearing or a judicial review. However, what did that actually do to that delay? We delayed it over a Christmas period when children really should be at a point where they should be with their families, not being stressed about a test that's going to happen immediately after the Christmas break. So I think the delay that happened, whilst it was somewhat welcome, in some respects it made the issue worse. I think the other issue with this is that the transfer process, whether you're academically selecting for that or you're just moving to a post-primary school, is ongoing. It needs to happen. There are timeframes in which the Department of Education, the Education Authority are working towards, and they need to have decisions now. Because, Minister, if you put a process in place because of a response to a further wave, then you're going to have a situation where teachers, parents are having to prepare for that change of policy, which we did see happen with the ASA levels. So certainly the ask from this debate is that we have some sort of contingency arrangement around this so that people can potentially prepare for this and expect what's coming, rather than creating that stress that seemed to have existed with the previous qualifications. And the last point I will make is around your opportunities to actually do anything. Speaking with school teachers, they tell me that despite the autonomy that they have through the Board of Governors, they still have to work through Department of Education directives. So if you, as Minister, were to issue a ministerial directive, again caveated by the fact that this is an extraordinary year, would that stand? Essentially, does he have the power to do something about this? Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
Okay, as no other member has indicated to speak, we now have the Minister who is up to 20 minutes to respond. Okay, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. I didn't catch what was said from a secondary position there, but thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I want to respond, thank you for the opportunity to respond to this debate, and I thank all those who have contributed to the debate. I suppose it is not surprising that the debate has been a mixture about the specific arrangements of this year in terms of COVID, and while I appreciate it was not the intention of the committee to look beyond that, there have been quite a lot of members who have gone into the area of academic selection. It's inevitable, I think, as Mr. Allister said, the two are inextricably linked. And indeed, there will be a suspicion amongst many of us who are supportive of academic selection that for many this is seen as a certain level of opportunity. But let me start, I suppose, at least, while there will be a divergence of opinion on this issue, although I don't intend to divide on the motion, with permission of the Deputy Speaker, I want to maybe make one comment or one area at the very start, which slightly breaches protocol, but I suspect that the House will at least unite around. Maybe the only thing that they unite around, what I have to say. And it's to indicate, because I know it's against protocol to mention any particular civil servant, I suppose it is important as Minister to place on record. Today marks the last day directly in Rathgale House of the Permanent Secretary, Derek Baker. I think somebody who has contributed greatly throughout his public life to the civil service, somebody who has contributed greatly to education, who has offered wise counsel, who has been a steady hand and a steady mind throughout various crises, and particularly, I suppose, in the years of absence, whenever we didn't have a fully functioning executive, gave that leadership. And I think it is important to place on record my thanks, and I think the thanks of this House, because I think Derek is somebody that is universally respected across the political divide, across the full education sector. So if I'll give way briefly on that.
I appreciate that Derek Baker worked along with me as a Deputy Permanent Secretary, and I concur with your remarks about him. He was an excellent public servant.
Again, it's good to see him working alongside you. John didn't actually spoil him at any stage in that regard. I suppose that's where the level of harmony on some of these issues may slightly diverge. Obviously, the motion talks about contingency plans arising out of the survey. Now, I welcome the survey. I would say I think it is only fair to point out that there will be limitations within any survey, and not least this survey as well. We've got to recognise that in terms of the survey, it is a survey which by its nature is self-selecting. It was inviting people to effectively log on. There is no doubt that there will be some people who have logged on more than once. And therefore, there will be limitations, I suppose, to what we can draw out of the survey. Nevertheless, it is clear that, and indeed it is also the case, that if you're having a survey, it is likely that those who have concerns over current situation are a lot more likely to, broadly speaking, engage in a survey than those who are, generally speaking, contented with arrangements. However, I think it does belie ranges of genuine concerns that are out there. I would be extremely surprised if there wasn't, in current circumstances, a range of concerns that are happening throughout society on a whole range of issues. It's interesting to note that of those who took part in the survey, 85% still intend to enter their children for the test in terms of parents, and that 88% of young people responded were still intending to take the tests. However, as I indicated, there were concerns that were raised. So before I move on to the broader transfer process, including criteria, there's a number of issues raised by parents in the report that I want to highlight. These include concerns about pupils not having enough time to prepare for the tests and the possibility of further disruption to schools due to COVID. I understand that both providers have made changes to their test arrangements by allowing extra time for young people to sit the test. The dates are ones that are chosen by the providers. I think the only role directly for the department in terms of the dates is ensuring that the tests can be completed, results can be issued, and transfer can take place within time. It's also that the tests are not an overall standard which must be met. The tests assess literacy and numeracy skills which are core to the key Stage 2 curriculum. Concern is also expressed that some children may not have access to computers or home-based support if they miss school. And where this happens, schools will have contingency plans for remote learning which reflects the needs of pupils. So a number of measures have already been taken. So the provision of IT devices to pupils in 3 phases, identification of existing devices owned by schools, the purchase of the 3,600 additional laptops, and the purchase of 8,000 additional Chromebooks for disruption to pupils assessed by EA and schools as most in need. And that included P7, who have also... I'll give way briefly.
I didn't realise that school equipment such as the laptops were being used particularly for this purpose. Does the Minister then agree that Engage funding is allowed to be used by primary schools for this purpose?
Members is conflating 2 particular issues. What I've said, first of all, this is not in relation to the Engage programme, this is in relation to IT equipment. What I've said that pupils across the board have been able to access, according to prioritised years within that, have been able to access direct equipment, because, and that has been something irrespective of whether the child is doing the test, whether they're in a different year or not, but it is one of the mitigations that have been put in place. Well, very briefly, because I have a number of things I want to get through.
Question, Minister, how many of those devices have been provided to P7 pupils?
Bigger to hand, but I'm sure we can get that for you in relation to that. Additionally, we've worked with BT to ensure a range of 2,500 MiFi devices, which is mobile connectivity, and provided 8,300 Wi-Fi vouchers for disadvantaged children. More generally, the C2K education system supports online access to school services in a way which I think puts us in a better position than some other jurisdictions. And at present, there are significant elements of the service which can be accessed remotely. All users have access to C2K secure online learning cloud from home, and they'd be addressed by My School Portal. Now, nobody is suggesting that any form of remote learning is something which is the ideal situation, which is why it's important that we have face-to-face teaching. But there are provisions that are put within the system. Mention's been made of the Engage programme. Within that context, 11.2 million has been made available through the Engage programme allocated to schools. It is up to the individual schools, according to the budget that they have, as to how that is directly used. So there's no direction from the department as to how to do that. And indeed, this is about, as people have made reference to, the various levels of academic catch-up. And additionally, there's some other schemes that have been put in place. Now, mention has been made, I suppose, about safety. We would anticipate that there will be a range of measures put in. I'll come into those in a moment. But in particular, the setting of admissions criteria is a matter for the boards of governors of individual schools. The Education Order 1997 provides the legal power for setting admissions to board of governors, not to my department. One of the members asked earlier, why is this being allowed? In part because it's the law. And indeed, legally, I think I would be in breach if I was to move away from that. My department can and does publish guidance on post-primary admissions process, which they've got a regard to, but it is recommended what schools should and shouldn't use. But it remains for individual boards of governors to define the criteria they wish to use to select children for admission. Now, I think one of the concerns that will be there from parents will be what levels of safety are put in place. Now, first of all, let's put this in a level of context. We are saying, can safety arrangements be made on a particular days, which, roughly speaking, about 10,000 pupils will actually be sitting tests? We should also realise that in terms of the school system, there are about 1/3 children coming through the school gates every single day. So can provision be made to ensure that there is adequate safety for children? Yes, it can, by way of a range of measures. And so, while ultimately this is the responsibility of the schools concerned and the testing organisations, there are a range of arrangements that have been put to the organisations to ensure that there is safety. So we're talking about staggered arrival in school groups and bubbles, hand sanitisation on arrival in building and classrooms. Indeed, what this can be is a level, I'll outline a number of these, is a level of precursor to what will actually happen in terms of examinations, because the public health arrangements on this occasion will be the same as they will be happening on a daily basis. So there will be the option of face coverings for pupils. Pupils will be seated in class bubbles, which are 2 metres apart. There will be a range of hand washing arrangements. There will be no food on site. There will be a range of from the centre heads side of it, that there will be oversights of arrival of pupils in bubbles, that they're ensuring that no parents or visitors will be directly on the school grounds while the tests are taking place, ensuring school gates will be closed to parents and visitors while the tests are taking place, explanation of arrangements to pupils, oversight of staff and pupils, oversight where pupils are wearing face coverings of that, and indeed in terms of centre staff, and there's a wide range of these things. There will be supervision, there will be maintaining safe distance when checking examination numbers, again encouragement of frequent hand washing, supervision of class bubbles and social distancing in the classroom, and a wide range of measures which will be taken into place. But what we are saying is that what arrangements are being made for around about 10,000 pupils on those particular occasions. I should point out there is a slight level of inaccuracy when we're talking about a potential for 5 tests. The PPTC offer 2 tests, the second of which is essentially for those who've missed the first test. There's around about 1,000 pupils who will do both tests within that. So there will be a range of contingencies that will be put in place. But the motion calls on me to outline contingency plans for post-primary arrangements. Now, if that means that the Assembly wishes me to detail the admissions criteria that will be used should entrance test exams not be available. I'm not in a position to do that, because the legal responsibility for setting admissions tests lies with the Board of Governors. I cannot set the criteria used by schools. Now, I'll give way briefly, yes.
Minister, law has been enacted in this Assembly during COVID-19 that has suspended statutory duties for kids with special educational needs. Are you not the Minister of Education? Can you not change the law?
Frankly, I'm not going to be changing primary legislation. I cannot do that on that basis on it. I think that would be a quick way towards judicial review. But let us take a look. Schools have got the right, Boards of Governors got the right to have academic selection or not use academic selection, and it's been used very successfully on both occasions. On this occasion, there are a number of schools on a one-year basis have indicated that they are not using academic selection. But in terms of the criteria that they intend to use, what has been revealed of that, and I think Mr McNulty made reference to it, in the press statement that they were saying they weren't going to be using academic selection, they would be largely drawing on their existing criteria, which prioritised the children of existing teachers within the schools, which prioritised those who had a sibling at the school, for those who, depending upon accident birth, whether if it was an all-boys or an all-girls school, depending upon, for instance, whether they had a brother or a sister, whether or not, those sort of things which are essentially a form of, and indeed whether their parents in some cases went to that school. Now, if we are truly looking for a more egalitarian society, certainly schools are entitled to use their own criteria. But I have to say a system which selection at a grammar school is done by form of hereditary right is not one which strikes me as being one that is more equal than what is there at present. But let us also cut to the heart of this issue. Now, it is perfectly reasonable for somebody to make an argument essentially for comprehensive education. I mean, I can't remember, it was either Mr McCrossan or Mr McNulty said the SDLP from day one have opposed academic selection. I perfectly accept that. That is a perfectly reasonable position. The party opposite has also been very clear for many years on where it stands on academic selection. But first of all, if we simply go down the route of abolishing academic selection, what we will have... No, I want to get through some things in relation to this. I will not make the same mistake as Mr O'Toole made on me in that regard. The position in terms of academic selection is if we simply abolish of academic selection, notwithstanding our changes in law, we have a largely comprehensive system. But we will have a comprehensive system as operates largely in England, with a small percentage of students who will have fee-paying schools, who will have public schools. Now, again, I challenge anybody to say that's a fair position, but it's a reasonable enough, at least, position to put forward. And it's a position that some parties have put forward for many, many years. What is not the case, though, is we cannot, if we do not have transfer tests, academic selection requires transfer tests. There is not an adequate level of information which allows comparisons between pupils that can allow academic selection without transfer tests. We've got to face the reality of the situation of where we are today. If we abolish transfer tests or we stop transfer tests, then we are not using academic selection. And I think that goes as a logical construct. If we are not using academic selection, then we destroy the basis on which grammar schools exist. The reality is, I think there is a perfectly reasonable enough argument to say, abolish academic selection, have an entirely comprehensive system. I think that is at least a fair and valid argument to be made. What cannot be made is an argument which says, abolish transfer tests, abolish academic selection, but we're very much in favour of the grammar school system. That is at best intellectual gymnastics, dancing on the head of a pin. In reality, it is intellectually dishonest. And I have a lot more faith for those, for instance, like Claire Bailey and the Green Party, who will say, abolish academic selection, let us have an entirely comprehensive system, let us not have grammar schools. But let us not pretend that there will be support for the grammar schools when academics, or at least pretend that you're supporting grammar schools while abolishing academic selection. It is simply a thing. Yes, I will give way.
Thanks, given that's targeted at me without actually saying so, accusing me of intellectual dishonesty, which is an absolute disgrace given the topic that is under debate here today. There are non-selective grammar schools in Northern Ireland. How does that square with what he's saying? And this isn't about schools, this is about educating children. So for the avoidance of doubt, the Alliance Party is absolutely clear We do not think academic selection is fair or necessary. And can you move on to saying what the contingency plan is here, rather than bizarre attacks on me?
Well, it did seem that, interesting enough, I've never actually mentioned the member concerned, but he seems to have hit a little bit of a sore point. Look, the reality is you cannot have your cake and eat it. If you want to have grammar schools, then you've got to have academic selection. If you have academic selection, you've got to have transfer tests. There is no point trying to pretend that that magic circle can be squared. Yes, we're happy to give way to.
Giving way. There's a primary school within my constituency that doesn't have standardised tests, and they believe that there is enough data that exists that can actually ensure a form of academic selection without actually having the transfer test. To the extent that his permanent secretary, before the minister's appointment, had actually visited the school and had commissioned a report on it. Is that something the minister wants to comment on?
The position on it is, in terms of when you're judging if all schools at primary level are doing everything like for like, or holding data like for like, are doing internal testing like for like, the reality is that in any school, and selection will happen, I mean, let us not kid ourselves, selection is going to happen within the system, whether we like it or not. The only issue is whether whatever flaws are there with the current system, it is largely one that is based, for grammar schools, on the basis of academic selection. If we move to a situation where we cannot ultimately compare pupils like for like, and we are certainly not in that position in relation to that, then you cannot have academic selection. It is a simple reality of the situation. I'll give way briefly.
Thank the member for giving way. I think it's very unfair to characterise the criteria being employed by the Newry schools and Kilkeel School as anything other than egalitarian.
And look, I've no doubt the member very rightly will want to defend the schools in his own area. But if you take a look at the criteria, whenever the press release, and to be fair to them, I don't think they've finalised their position, but they said within their proposals that they would largely base their selection on the basis of their existing criteria. 4 out of the 5 of those in at least 4 of the schools, and I think 3 out of 4 or 5 in the other school, all centre around the links that that person has through their family to the school. No, the member is wrong in relation to that. It is about whether or not, at least a number of the cases, whether your parents went to the school, whether your sibling went to the school, whether indeed you are the oldest child or not, and therefore, depending upon how your brother or sister got on, whether they would have a position in that, and also whether you're the son or daughter of a teacher at the school. So all of those are directly linked in with the personal circumstances that has nothing at all to do with your academic ability. So let us not pretend, and there is a perfect right in those schools, and I've already indicated to those schools that if that is the position for this year, legally that counts not as a development proposal, they are entitled to use that criteria. But I find it very difficult to justify that is in any way fair. We will make sure that all action is taken to ensure that transfer tests are done in line with public health criteria. No one has anything to fear from transfer tests. There is no doubt, and we will come back to this, a fundamental divide within this Assembly, within society as a whole, on the issue of academic selection, which will not be sorted out today.
I would ask the member or the minister to draw his remarks to a close.
And on that basis, I await for now the certain level of verbal punishment meeting from the chair of the committee.
I now call the chair of the committee, Mr. Chris Lyttle, to wind on the debate, and the chair has up to 10 minutes.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I begin by speaking as Chairperson of the Education Committee. On behalf of the Education Committee, I'd like to thank the 8,500 respondents to our online post-primary transfer survey, and the Education Minister and Assembly members for contributing to this important debate. Deputy Speaker, may I also take this opportunity to pay tribute to the courage and the public service of teaching and non-teaching staff in schools across Northern Ireland. We thank you, and the Education Committee will continue to support you. The Education Committee online survey and this motion are about the safe and fair post-primary transfer of thousands of 10 and 11-year-old children this year during a global public health pandemic. The responses to this survey merit close consideration. One of the clearest responses was the rejection of the decision supported by the Education Minister to delay the AQE and PPTC examinations to immediately after the 2-week non-school-based Christmas break. The Education I'm happy to, if you don't take too long. Yep.
Very briefly, no. Remember, we were able to facilitate transfer. The choice of dates, of the change of that legally, is of the two organisations themselves. So I have not chosen to delay on that basis, but I can ensure that transfer takes place within the proper timeframe on those dates.
Okay, and I think the Education Minister therefore ought to reflect on what the public rejection of that approach says for decision-making to date to this matter. There may be some variance of opinion in this Assembly on post-primary transfer testing in 2021 and in the future, although I think there's more of a consensus here than some people want to accept. The Education Committee online survey has, at the very least, demonstrated a serious concern for post-primary transfer testing this year, a need for further urgent consideration of this matter and a clear demand from parents and teachers for reform of post-primary transfer arrangements. The Education Minister approach of doing nothing is clearly at odds with that demand. Regrettably, the collapse of the Executive for 3 years during this mandate has prevented the Education Committee from showing leadership on this issue and restarting its inquiry into this matter. The Educational Achievement Panel, an independent review of education, must therefore consider post-primary transfer reform and how we build an integrated education system to deliver equal educational opportunity for all. Deputy Speaker, I'll now speak. Yeah, certainly.
Member for taking an intervention. Firstly, can I highlight that I think we are no wiser to the contingency plans, and maybe it was the Minister's generosity with given interventions, but I certainly am no wiser to what your contingency plans are in the event that there is a lockdown and these tests can't go ahead. But also, would the member agree with me that in terms of the inquiry, that we have had inquiries, we have had reports, we have had so much information to tell us that academic selection is bad for all of our children, that we could actually bury ourselves in every school in the 6 counties underneath it. We now need to take action.
Wholeheartedly agree. Indeed, I think the last one of those reports investigating links in attainment and deprivation was commissioned by the Joint Office of First and Deputy First Minister, which clearly recommended reform of post-primary transfer, and yet delivery on that has not taken place. Mr Deputy Speaker, I'll now speak in my capacity as Alliance MLA and turn to the contributions to the debate and start with the Minister of Education. He has accused some of us expressing concern in relation to this issue as opportunistic. I think that's disgraceful. I think there are 2/3 of 8,500 people expressing legitimate and serious concerns in relation to this matter. He has legitimately raised issues of limitations in relation to the survey. Of course, all surveys will have limitations. I suppose the question is, what has he and the Department of Education, with all its sizeable resources compared to the Education Committee, done to engage with parents, teachers and children and young people in relation to this issue? He has, as some of his colleagues have, referenced that 85% of respondents are still sitting tests. He failed to acknowledge that 46% of that 85% stated in response to the survey that they are doing so because they feel like they have no other choice. Yeah, I'll give way.
Thank the member for giving way. Would the member share a concern with me that the Minister's approach may be to himself sometimes, and his constant obsession towards socialism and attacks towards me is a reflection of a Minister who is not confident with his disastrous handling of the education system throughout this pandemic?
I think we need to engage respectfully with each other in relation to this issue. I think it is regrettable when this debate does descend below respectful engagement, even if opinions do differ. I think there are points of engagement, and I really wish this Assembly and the Education Committee, if it has time, does engage substantively on the issue, takes views from all MLAs, from all concerned parties, and that was at the heart of what the survey was about at the end of the day. The Minister references mitigations he has put in place for educational inequality during lockdown, but in my opinion, there is a lack of specificity. He's referenced laptops, Chromebooks, and yet coming to a debate today in relation to post-primary transfer, he can't specify how much of that resource has actually found its way to primary 7 children. He references the education order that provides that schools, boards of governors set emissions criteria. As I intervened, this Assembly and this Executive has enacted exceptional changes of law during this time period. We have changed the fabric of our way of life. To say that he cannot intervene in those ways, I think, is an abdication of responsibility. He's referenced safety measures, limited safety measures in terms of masks, hand washing, no food and entrance arrangements. I think my colleague Kelly Armstrong asked some extremely legitimate questions with regards to what advice he has sought and received from the Public Health Agency, from the Minister for Health, in relation to risks involved with bringing this number of children outside of bubbles together in order to sit for transfer tests in January and February. I suppose I would ask if there are members of this House that have loved ones in shielding circumstances, how they would feel about sending them into the circumstances the Minister is planning to support in January and February. The Minister has responded to the admissions criteria being used by other schools that have courageously decided to postpone the use of academic selection this transfer test year. His department has a circular for all grant-aided schools on admissions criteria. What has he done to lead on the non-academic criteria that is being used by schools? I haven't heard a substantive proposal from him in terms of what that non-academic criteria ought to look like, and yet his department has a departmental circular on what it should look like, one of which is sibling. It does recommend against going beyond that in terms of family relation, but there is criteria there. He then attacks me, as he has become prone to doing, in relation to intellectual dishonesty. Well, that's a new one that I've heard. The Alliance Party is clear. We're against selective schools. It's my understanding that grammar education is an approach to education, not a system of academic selection. As I said in my opening, I give way.
Way. He's quite correct. Grammar is a managerial term in education set out in law. This term comprehensive has become a dirty word in education because in England comprehensive schools weren't properly politically led from the top and they weren't properly invested in. Comprehensive education is a good form of education when properly led and properly funded.
Thank the member for his intervention. As I said in my opening remarks, I don't think it's edifying. I don't think it's a serious response to this important matter to go down that route of rhetoric. I regret, Deputy Speaker, that I'm out of time in terms of referencing the many substantive contributions that were made throughout this debate here today. In particular, there is an attempt to describe this as a fractious, as a divisive issue. I think if you consider the political parties that contributed today that were with one voice, and that voice is fairly clear to me, Deputy Speaker, that it cannot be fair for the Education Minister to allow private transfer test providers to sit these tests in January and February for admission to post-primary schools. And I hope that the Minister does take action to put alternative contingency plans in place. Thank you.
Thank you, members. The question now is that the motion standing on the order paper be agreed. All those in favour say aye. Contrary, no.